considered the arguments made by the attorneys. The court has considered the statements made by the victims in this case. The court's going to find that the plea agreement is fair and reasonable under the circumstances. I want to acknowledge the Rusick family as well as the Watts family that showing mercy on Mr. Watts is understood. And I respect that decision to request that the district attorney not seek the death penalty in this case. And so the court is going to accept this plea bargain under the circumstances. Words that come to mind when I hear the evidence in this case are a senseless crime and the viciousness of the crime. And equally aggravating in this court's determination is the despicable act of disposing of the bodies in the manner in which they were done in this case. I've been a judicial officer now for starting my 17th year, and I could objectively say that this is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime that I have handled out of the thousands of cases that I have seen. And nothing less than a maximum sentence would be appropriate, and anything less than the maximum sentence would depreciate the seriousness of this offense. So the court is going to sentence Mr. Watts as follows. With regard to count number 1, murder in the first degree as it relates to Shanann Watts, the court is going to sentence you, sir, to a life sentence in the Colorado Department of Corrections, followed with no possibility of parole. And that is going to run consecutively to all but counts 3 and 4. With regard to count 2, as it relates to murder in the first degree with Bella, the court is going to sentence you to life in the Colorado Department of Corrections with no possibility of parole. With regard to count number 3, the court is going to sentence you as it relates to Celeste to life in the Colorado Department of Corrections with no possibility of parole. With regard to counts 4 and 5 relating to Bella and Celeste as a different theory of first-degree murder, the court is going to sentence you to life in the Colorado Department of Corrections, and legally those sentences must run concurrently as a different theory of first-degree murder. Recognizing the unlawful termination of pregnancy for the unborn child that has been named Nico, the court absolutely believes that the maximum sentence of 48 years would be appropriate to run consecutive to the other charges, with an additional mandatory parole period of 3 years as set forth by statute. With regard to count number 7, as it relates to tampering with a deceased body, as well as counts 8 and 9, each a class 3 felony, the court is going to impose a maximum sentence of 12 years each for those counts to run consecutively to the other counts. The court is going to order that the statutory fees be paid.
It begins in the quiet stillness of a Colorado morning, one so ordinary, so painfully mundane, that no one could have imagined the horror already unfolding behind closed doors. The sun had barely risen when a friend, concerned and uneasy, dialed 911 to report a missing pregnant woman and her 2 little girls. It sounded simple at first, like a misunderstanding or a delayed return home. But as officers stepped into the spotless suburban house on Saratoga Trail, It became clear that nothing about this disappearance felt normal. An untouched purse sat on the kitchen counter. A phone abandoned on the couch. No signs of struggle, yet everything felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath. The officers moved carefully, scanning each room, searching for any imprint of the family that should have been there, but wasn't. The home felt frozen, preserved in time. A half-made bed, a child's blanket on the floor, a ghost of routine lingering in the silent walls. And then, as body cameras recorded every moment, Chris Watts walked through the door. Calm, almost too calm. His face didn't carry the frantic panic of a husband terrified for his missing wife and daughters. Instead, he drifted through the house with an unsettling steadiness, touching objects that didn't need to be touched, explaining things no one had asked about, filling the silence with soft excuses and rehearsed observations. Police noted every movement, every unnecessary detail, every inconsistent sentence. And beneath it all, something darker pulsed. Because just hours earlier, within these same walls, a nightmare had unfolded. One that would soon become one of the most disturbing family murder cases in modern history. In the days that followed, the facade of a perfect family man would collapse. The videos of cheerful children, the smiling couple photos, the social media posts celebrating a growing family, each one would take on a chilling new meaning. And the world would soon hear a confession so cold, so devastating, that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend it. Chris Watts would later recount the moment his pregnant wife fought for breath, the moment he heard her beg for her life, and the moment he chose to continue anyway. But this story doesn't begin with the crime. It begins with an illusion, one carefully constructed, meticulously maintained, and ultimately shattered by the truth he could no longer hide. And behind that truth was an even darker whisper, one involving secrecy, infidelity, obsession, and a spiral into deception so deep that even those closest to Chris never saw the monster forming beneath the surface. This is the story of the Watts family murders. And this is where the mask begins to crack. To understand the unthinkable, you first have to step back into the world Chris and Shanann Watts built, a world that, from the outside, seemed almost impossibly normal. In the quiet suburb of Frederick, Colorado, they were the kind of family neighbors waved to without a second thought. Their homes sat among rows of nearly identical houses, the kind of place where children played in driveways and weekend barbecues blended into the rhythms of everyday life. Nothing about it suggested secrets, fractures, or doom. Shanann was the heartbeat of the family, ambitious, driven, a woman who carved her life out of the darkness of past illnesses and adversity. She documented her journey openly, sharing triumphs, fears, and dreams with a transparency that made strangers feel like they knew her. She loved deeply, lived intentionally, and poured herself into creating a stable, joyful life for her daughters, Bella and Celeste. To many, she seemed unstoppable, the kind of mother whose strength radiated through every family video, every photo, every hopeful message she posted online. Chris, by contrast, was quiet, reserved, a man who rarely spoke first but smiled easily when he did. In home videos, he appeared gentle and patient, lying on the floor playing with his daughters, or quietly listening as Shanann shared her excitement about their future. He was the kind of father who looked content surrounded by tiny voices and toys scattered across the living room floor. They met in 2010, and their relationship seemed to blossom quickly. Friends and family described them as opposites that somehow fit perfectly together, her energy balancing his calm, her drive complementing his steady silence. They married in 2012, bought a house, and began growing their family. Bella arrived first, followed by Cece, each child adding another layer of joy and responsibility to their lives. But beneath the picture-perfect surface, pressures were building. Financial strain grew quietly in the background as debt mounted and the couple filed for bankruptcy. Health issues shadowed Shanann and at unpredictable intervals, forcing her to manage flare-ups, doctor visits, and constant worry. And then there were the subtle shifts, moments too small to recognize at the time, but impossible to ignore in hindsight. Chris began to change. He became distant, leaner, more secretive. He started spending more time at the gym, more hours at work, more moments absorbed in his phone. The man who once seemed content with simple routines now seemed restless, like he was drifting into a life removed from the one he shared with his family. Shanann noticed. Her messages, posts, and interactions began revealing glimpses of a woman trying to hold her family together while sensing it slipping away. She confided in friends that Chris felt different, that something was off, that she couldn't put her finger on it, but the man she loved felt like a ghost wearing her husband's face. Still, she pushed forward, taking trips with her children, planning their third baby, imagining a future where everything would fall back into place. When she announced the pregnancy, she did so with excitement and pride, capturing Chris's reaction on video, unaware that behind his tight smile, something dark had already begun to grow. By the summer of 2018, the distance between them had become a quiet canyon. Shanann tried to bridge it with conversations, visits to family in North Carolina, handwritten letters, and messages filled with hope and fear. Yet each attempt seemed to deepen the divide instead of healing it. Because while Shanann was fighting to save her marriage, Chris was living a double life. And in his secret world, the foundations of everything he once valued began to rot. Slowly, quietly, then all at once. This story isn't just about a crime. It's about a family unraveling in ways no one saw until it was too late. The first red flags didn't erupt in a dramatic flash. They appeared quietly, thin cracks forming beneath the surface of a marriage already weighed down by exhaustion, debt, and unspoken fears. When Shanann traveled to North Carolina with the girls that summer, she hoped the distance would help her and Chris reconnect. She believed time apart might give him space to miss her, to rediscover the bond they once shared. But instead of drawing him closer, the space between them stretched wider, revealing a truth she could feel before she could prove. Phone calls grew shorter. Messages became colder. The man who once answered immediately now took hours, sometimes days, to respond. She sensed another presence, something or someone, pulling him away. She wrote about it. She worried aloud to friends. She questioned herself, wondering if stress or fatigue had changed him. But deep down, she knew. She recognized the emotional withdrawal, the secretive behavior, the unfamiliar distance in his voice. While Shanann was hundreds of miles away trying to understand the shift, Chris was stepping deeper into his hidden life. Weight loss became dramatic. New clothes started appearing. His interest in fitness became obsessive, transforming not just his body but his demeanor. He smiled differently. He walked differently. He seemed to float in a world no one else had access to. And then came the lies, small enough at first to seem harmless. Late nights at work that coworkers later denied. Errands that took too long. Workouts that stretched longer than the drive required. Every discrepancy was another thread unraveling, another piece of a truth he was desperately trying to bury. Shanann tried to confront the distance with love, sending long messages about her fears, her hopes, and her desire to rebuild what they once had. She poured her heart into words that went unanswered, each silence from Chris feeling heavier than the last. She reminded him of their history, their children, the dreams they had woven together. She reached out again and again, trying to grasp the edges of a man slipping into another reality. But the red flags didn't stop there. There were arguments during the trip, tensions with Chris's family that left Shanann feeling unwelcome and unsupported. She felt betrayed when she believed he failed to protect their children from situations that frightened her. What should have been a visit filled with family bonding turned into a trip marked by stress, tears, and emotional distance. Meanwhile, Chris was becoming someone else entirely. He started researching new beginnings, new lifestyles, and new futures. Futures that no longer included the woman he promised forever. His phone history shifted from mundane routines to searches about relationships, apartments, and escape. Photos and hidden messages painted a picture of a man building a life in the shadows. Shanann, desperate to save her marriage, returned home with the hope that face-to-face conversations might reconnect them. She believed honesty and vulnerability could repair the cracks. She believed Chris would choose his family. But each attempt seemed to push him further into secrecy. He stopped touching her, stopped sharing meals with her, stopped looking at her the way he once did. And in that silence, a chilling truth began to form. One she couldn't fully name, but one that weighed heavily on her spirit. These were more than red flags. They were warnings of a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. A storm she never imagined would end in catastrophe. Because as Shanann fought to save her family, Chris was already imagining a life without them. And soon he would act on those dark imaginings. It happened in the stillness before dawn, in that fragile hour when the world hasn't yet woken, and every sound echoes louder than it should. A silence so complete, it becomes unsettling. A silence that would soon hold the weight of an irreversible choice. Shanann returned home from her business trip exhausted, hopeful, and emotionally drained. In the glow of the porch light, a friend's camera captured her stepping inside. Never knowing these were the final moments of her life, she believed she was returning to her husband, to the father of her children, to the man she hoped still loved her. But what waited in that quiet house was a darkness she could not have imagined. Chris later described the moment in ways that chilled investigators to the bone. He admitted that something inside him had snapped. An impulse, a decision, a horrifying loss of control. He claimed he heard her plead for breath. He said the words haunted him, echoing in the back of his mind long after the air went still. But even as he recalled hearing her beg, he confessed something even more monstrous. He did not stop. What unfolded was not a burst of rage or a sudden accident. It was deliberate. It was sustained. It was a choice made in cold, suffocating quiet. When Shanann took her last breath, the house didn't move. The world didn't change. The silence simply deepened. But what came next revealed an even darker depth to his cruelty. Because in the minutes that followed, he turned his attention to his daughters, Bella and Celeste, the children who looked at him with trust, who loved him without hesitation, who believed he was their protector, were awakened and taken into his truck. Their small voices would later be remembered in the most heartbreaking way. Confused, frightened, asking questions Chris refused to answer. He drove them, alive, to the remote oil site where he worked. In the quiet of the long road, he didn't turn back. He didn't reconsider. He didn't see their fear and break under the weight of what he was about to do. Instead, he kept driving. Even now, the details of what happened at the oil field remain among the most disturbing in true crime history. The children saw him dispose of their mother, a sight no child should ever witness, a horror they should never have carried in their final moments. Reports indicate Bella fought for her life. She struggled. She cried out. She understood just enough to be terrified, and she resisted with the last strength she had. Those moments were short, but they were filled with more fear than any child should ever know. And Chris admitted hearing them. He admitted knowing exactly what he was doing. Yet he did not stop. When the last echoes of his daughter's voices faded, he believed the nightmare he created was hidden, buried beneath oil and dirt, sealed in tanks designed to erase the evidence. He thought no one would find them. He thought he could return home, send messages, and pretend nothing had happened. In those early morning hours, Chris Watts didn't just commit a crime. He crossed a line most people can't even comprehend. He destroyed the very people who loved him most. And he did so with a calmness that would later terrify even seasoned investigators. The house fell silent. The oil field grew still. And for a moment, it seemed as if the world would never know. But secrets like this don't stay buried for long, especially when the truth is soaked in betrayal, lies, and the faint, lingering echo of a voice begging for life. When Chris Watts drove away from the oil site that morning, he didn't look back. He believed he had buried the truth, so deep, so far, and so quietly, that no one would ever uncover the horror he left behind. As the sun rose over the Colorado plains, he rehearsed his story. He steadied his breathing. He tried to become the version of himself others expected to see. A worried husband, a confused father, a man with no idea where his family had gone. It didn't take long for the cracks to appear. By mid-morning, Shanann's friend grew concerned when she couldn't reach her. That worry turned into urgency, then fear. When she arrived at the Watts home and found no sign of Shanann or the children, she called police, an act that saved the investigation from being delayed even a single day. Chris arrived minutes later, wearing an expression investigators would later dissect frame by frame. His voice was calm, his hands fidgeted, his eyes darted. It was as if he was carefully performing a role, trying to imitate panic but unable to access genuine emotion. Inside the home, the scene was wrong in every possible way. Shanann's purse was untouched. Her medicine was still there. Her phone, her lifeline, sat abandoned. Nothing pointed to a voluntary disappearance. Everything pointed to a disruption, something sudden, something violent. But the turning point came next. The neighbor's surveillance footage. The single moment that shattered Chris Watts' carefully constructed lie. When officers watched the video, they saw Chris backing his truck into the driveway at an unusual angle before dawn, something he had never done before. They watched him pacing back and forth, loading and unloading items with frantic precision. The neighbor, uneasy, quietly said what he felt. Something isn't right. From that second on, Chris was no longer the worried husband. He was the primary suspect. Investigators began peeling back layers of his story, and what they found wasn't just suspicious. It was damning. His phone records exposed late-night calls and messages to Nicole Kessinger. His texts to Shanann were staged. His search history held clues to a double life he was desperate to protect. And deleted data raised difficult questions, questions that would eventually lead him to confess. The forensic puzzle tightened around him with chilling speed. Drone footage revealed disturbed earth at the oil site. GPS logs tracked his exact movements. Digital footprints mapped out his lies with cold accuracy. When investigators sat Chris down for questioning, they watched him crumble in real time. His story shifted. His answers faltered. His face tightened. The calm mask he wore so confidently began to crack. But the moment that broke everything was the polygraph. Chris failed it spectacularly. Not just a little, not barely, completely. And when confronted with the results, he didn't fold into grief or fear. He folded into strategy. He offered a story designed to redirect guilt. One more lie in a timeline already tangled with deceit. But nothing could hide the truth anymore. The evidence had spoken. The bodies had been found. And the world now knew what Chris Watts had done. Yet even then, even when the truth was exposed, the darkest confessions were still waiting inside a prison cell. Confessions he wouldn't reveal until months later, when the weight of his crimes finally began to crush the last remaining pieces of the person he pretended to be.